Nonprofit Quarterly and the Movement for Black Lives are launching a 6-part series focused on social justice. Right now, we're going to talk with Dr. Amara Enyia. She is the Movement for Black Lives public policy expert. Glad to have you here on the show. So first and foremost, walk us through what is this 6-part series and what do you hope to accomplish with it?
Absolutely. It's really great to be here with you, Roland, to talk about this series. So we launched this series last year, in fact, because we felt that it was absolutely imperative to talk about what an economic policy vision for Black people must look like. We have been tracking, particularly in the last 3-4 years since COVID, the economic fallout for Black communities. We have been tracking issues around wealth or the lack thereof for Black communities. We've been tracking issues around housing, the unaffordability of housing, conversations around guaranteed basic income, reparations. And it was important for us to set forth what is a vision, an economic policy vision for Black people that addresses the economic injustices, but also is forward-thinking, forward-facing. And so we partnered with Nonprofit Quarterly to do this series and put forth and engaged a number of folks who are on the ground doing this work, experts who can really help us to craft that vision and really put it forth to the masses.
So again, vision is one thing, but reality is another. And so what do you hope this is going to accomplish, is going to achieve? How do you get people, how do you make this economic issue a reality?
Absolutely. So that's a great question. So one of the things that we tried to do was make sure that in every article in the series, it sets forth concrete examples where work is already taking place on the ground, with the idea that our people are we're not just speaking theoretically about what's possible, but we are talking about initiatives that have actually been launched where people can plug in and amplifying work that's already happening. So for example, we lifted up guaranteed basic income pilots that have gotten off the ground in cities across the country. We are talking about participatory budgeting, which is a mechanism that can be used to create more control for our communities over their municipal budgets. We've talked about the work that's already happening in the philanthropic space around reparations. And we talk about reparations for the war on drugs and what that looks like. We talked about housing and some of the organizing that's actually happening in places like Washington, D.C. And so we wanted to make sure that everything that we're putting forth is grounded in the reality and the material conditions of our people. And so we're not operating just in theory or, pie in the sky thinking, but what is actually going to tangibly affect Black people's lives.
Well, one of the things, so do y'all address all of these corporations that announce billions of dollars to the Black community in the wake of the death of George Floyd? And frankly, most of that hasn't even been spent. I haven't seen, I've raised this issue with the NAACP, with the National Urban League. I've spoken about this at HBCUs. And so what organization, who is going to hold these people accountable to the promises that they made? Is this a part of this?
Well, it's certainly part of the conversation. And so we've done pieces in the past and even organized in the past around the lack of or really the lack of follow through from many of the corporations that made these pledges in 2020. And then when we looked maybe a year later, even 2 years later, we found that there wasn't that much follow through. And so a lot of our work has been in shining light on that lack of follow through, also really trying to get beneath the layers of the PR, the public relations campaigns that many of these corporations had put forth, claiming that they wanted to invest in our communities, claiming that they wanted to have some impact on these long-standing injustices, the wealth gap, et cetera. And so we've worked to shine light on not only the issues, but the commitments and the lack of follow-through, that no entity is exempt from their responsibility in addressing, for example, the size of the wealth gap and our ability to hold these corporations accountable and to be unafraid to do so is something that we've stood on.
But again, shining light is one thing, but Who is calling them out? Are there plans for the movement of Black Lives to actually to protest, to do more? Because again, whenever we have, look, it's just like when we talk about money here in this industry here, we're trying to hold these companies accountable for the $340 billion being spent every single year in advertising. Black-owned media gets 1%. Then we look at the money that's being spent in venture capital. We're talking about less than 2%. I mean, we can go on and on and on. And so you have folks, you have a number of people out there who are advocating for reparations. I'm also saying there are billions upon billions upon billions of dollars, heading towards $1 trillion that are being spent every single year. The federal government, $600 billion in contracts annually, 1.67% going to African Americans. And so there's real money being dropped right now that we are not a part of. And I think part of the issue is that we do not have a collective action to deal with in terms of pushing people to say, no, we got to start not just shining a light, but putting you on Front Street. Congressional Black Caucus at the foundation at AOC this year, they had a big meeting focusing on economics and fiscal policy. 60, 70 people in the room. Robert Smith was there. Diddy was there. Chairman Horsford. You had NAACP, Derek Johnson, Martin Morrell, Reverend Sharpton, Black Economic Alliance, Black Economic Forum, all these groups. We met in October. My whole deal is, it's March. Nothing has happened. And so we have to have, I just fundamentally believe, action to be able to begin to change these numbers, to access those dollars, to change our community, to change our businesses.
Absolutely. And one of the things that we have tried to do, and for example, on the municipal front, when we talk about city budgets, is really walking people through the process to understand how close they actually are and how they do have the ability to have impact on city budgets. So we've had cities where where individuals from the community came in and said, this is what we envision, this is what we need, and have put forth line by line in a budget, here's how we allocate funding from this to that. That same rationale exists, I think, also in the corporate sector. One is to remove the myth of the distance between people on the ground in their communities and what these corporations are doing, that there is a benefit to collective action when we have put certain companies, for example, in the crosshairs, whether to protest them, but also to expose what it is that they're doing, right, which is very important. But there's work that we have to do at the ground level to educate people and to handhold, to show this is actually what it looks like. This is some of the numbers that you set forth, and here's how we can actually tangibly reallocate or push these companies to do what they said that they were going to do. So there have been some instances in 2020. I know JP Morgan Chase, which is not the best example, but when some of that on-the-ground work was taking place, and we showed that they lent more to one predominantly white community in Chicago than to all of Chicago's Black communities combined. Then they made some shifts and created new programming and things of that nature, right? So it's an example of the kinds of pressure that is necessary for these corporations. And we, as folks on the ground, as organizers in our communities, not believing that there's so much distance between the kind of change that we can get if we apply pressure and if we are very clear and specific on the ways that those funds should be allocated and have some understanding of how corporations are actually using those funds so that we can propose the alternatives to them. It's not just enough to say we need more resources. We have to clearly articulate what we need and for what purpose, and then hold the corporations accountable to that.
I think, last question here, I also believe that what has to happen is the education piece. Because, what I experience constantly, even with this show, a lot of our folks don't even understand how the dots are connected. And so when we're talking about public policy, we're talking about who's in control of budgets, things along those lines. You got these people who are saying, man, Democrats ain't nothing, Republicans ain't nothing, I'm getting down to politics. And I'm sitting there going, that's where the money is. So you can sit here and say, I'm getting out of politics, but that makes no sense because who controls city services, county services, school district, who controls state services and federal? We're talking about, again, trillions of dollars. The last thing black folks can do is check out of a political process, because when you do that, you're checking out of the economic process.
Absolutely. I mean, the politics fundamentally is about who's getting what. And so the people who are in the game or who are at the table will largely make the decisions about how resources are allocated and to whom. And so we actually have additional responsibility, because we know that for so long, those who are at the table implemented and instituted policies that would deliberately exclude Black people. And we can run down the history of that, whether it's redlining, whether it's just looking at local procurement budgets and which are Black vendors getting access to procurement opportunities in your local city, right? So we have an additional responsibility, because we know that those who've been at those tables have largely intentionally excluded our people. And if we check out of the process, then we actually have no way of influencing the decisions that are made, particularly around how budgets are developed and how resources are allocated.
Where can people access the 6-part series?
So they can find the 6-part series on Nonprofit Quarterly's website. If you just type in Vision for Black Lives, Economic Policy Agenda, any of those keywords, you'll see all of the articles. Again, we talk about reparations, we talk about guaranteed basic income, we talk about housing, the lack of affordability, we talk about the wealth gap. Black households, 24 cents to every every dollar for white households. These are very real, affecting our community. So we encourage folks. Vision for Black Lives Economic Policy Agenda. You can also learn more at M4BL.org, where we have the Vision for Black Lives, our robust policy agenda for Black people, and folks can read it and digest it. And especially in this political climate where we have to articulate what we want, not just say what we don't want, but clearly articulate what we want and a pathway to get there. Just really want to encourage folks to check it out and to continue to follow us on all platforms.